thunderdome of cyanobacteria and algae fighting each other for the same food. I use 2-Hour Aquarist and Aquarium Co-op. These are two very good brands. That's my tank in the picture there. This hobby has taught me one thing, it's patience. It isn't fast. You went online, you get 100 different answers, all different extreme things. You don't know what to do, but don't worry, I'm gonna break it down pretty simple. I'll show you how you can have a nice tank that is basically algae-free, that you're not scraping the glass all the time. There is some algae in my tanks, there's gotta be, but if you don't have some algae in there, it's a sign of imbalance, but when it's taking over, it's a sign of imbalance. We'll get more into that later. I'm gonna run through a list of the algaes that are most common, and we're gonna go in order that we see them in a new tank. Now you can do things to minimize this or absolutely avoid it altogether. As I go through this list, it'll be kind of in the order that we see it appear in new tanks. Algae bloom, a green algae in the water, it's green and cloudy. It's usually a cause of overfeeding, and when we're maybe just new to the fish hobby and really just need a pinch, they say, you know, what they can consume within a minute or so. When you see a green algae bloom, the idea right here would be probably to turn the light down a little bit. It's probably on too long if it's just a basic setup tank. If it's a higher light, let's turn the intensity of the light down and let's look at the lighting times. A good starting point for lights, I would say, is 6 hours. I like to start low and work my way up. It avoids a lot more problems that way, opposed to starting high and trying to back down, but you've already caused the problem. I don't recommend to do a water change at this point unless you test your nitrates and they're above 40 ppm. And that's if you have plants in it, that would be a better thing. So if it's up pretty high, it's probably time for water change, but otherwise don't change the water because it only fuels the food that the algae is feeding on. It will clear itself in time, and just really by reducing the light. You don't have to do anything as extreme as a blackout covering the tank, but right now, maybe just reducing the light a little bit and feeding a little less, and it should clear itself up. The second type of bloom we see is a white or a gray bloom, and this is actually a bacterial bloom. And this is a little bit different from an algae bloom. It is a bacteria that is working with photosynthesis, but it isn't an algae. Also with this one, I don't recommend to do a water change unless your nitrates are above 40 ppm. It's usually caused by too much light in the tank, and it's probably best just turn the light off. You don't have to go as extreme again as covering it up unless we're looking for a real rapid problem solver, plus at the same time if it's really bad. But at the same time, we're killing a bacteria now, not an algae. So you may see an ammonia spike. So it's important for you to be testing ammonia and making sure that we don't see an ammonia spike as we kill off this bacteria. Also very common causes is too much light and overfeeding, and really is only seen in new tanks that have probably just been set up. That's when this has a first chance to bloom. It'll feed and eat basically all of its food up, and they'll diminish in population. They're always there. They're microbacteria. You can't really see them. There's just so many that now they're refracting the light in the tank, and that's why we're seeing it. Another way to handle this is UV filtration. UV filtration will clear this in 24 hours, either one, the green or the white-gray bacteria bloom. Personally, I use UV in my tanks, and really there is no downside to UV other than the cost of the product and maintaining it. Let's say if it has a pump or bulbs go bad, these things you're gonna have to pay for running it, the wattage of the bulb that's being used. So there's really no downside to it other than its cost. How it works is by passing the water through a UV light, it kills, or let me say not kills, it makes the bacteria sterile so it can't reproduce. It causes cell wall deformation, just like us exposed to too much UV light. Well, this is an exposure. Now it's different ways to use UV for viral and bacterial. So this is really geared, this hobby stuff is geared towards bacterial. You could build your own, it's a little more complex, but if you slow the flow down, there's more light exposure time. It could be used in a viral sense too. So with the algae, waiting it out is really not a problem. If you reduce the light time and see if it, goes away on its own, just understand that every time you make a change, give it 2 weeks to really show its effect. As you'll see as I go through this, I'll say a lot of times too much light. I think in the hobby that we have the lights now that are just overkill and really just way too much light. But I think that really the way we should look at it is that if we start with a light and we run it at 30% of its power, it's gonna run cooler, it's gonna last longer, and it's more flexible for somebody that has the same size tank as growing high, hard to grow plants, high light plants that require CO2, kind of like the tank behind me, that I need to be able to turn the light up much higher so they could sell the one light and just you have the ability to turn it down. So my recommendation again is start at a low number, say 30–40% of the light's capacity, and then give it a couple of weeks, see how everything is, see how it's growing, see how your nutrients are, what your demands. Every tank is different, from plant placement to shading to plant demands. So there's no one answer when it comes to lighting. I would say 30–40% at 6 hours, see the reply. From there, maybe I want to see more growth, it's not using enough nutrients, go to 8 hours, but don't change the intensity. Only make one change at a time, because then you're going to be hard to quantify what change had what reaction. So there is a limit to everything. And if you think of the light as the rain, would you rather get poured on and everything all at once and you're screaming and running for shelter, or a light drizzle at a longer period of time? So my feeling of low light over a longer period of time is a lot better, and also your fish will appreciate it more, because the intense spotlight is not really what they want. The light is proven to be something that agitates them. So if we can keep the light lower and on longer, you'll probably have better success and easier time tuning it in to what your tank needs. Diatom algae is that brown algae that grows on everything and is just a green slime, and it's a microalgae that was very early in life. It's probably, I think I read that it produces about 20–50% of the oxygen every year. It's really that much. So it's found basically everywhere on everything, and it eventually finds its way into your tank. And in the beginning cycle, as we're raising all these different bacterias, we're finding the balance. This is going to thrive, and it's going to feed off some minerals in your tank, and eventually it's going to burn out its food supply or reduce it to the amount that it can't thrive. And really just manual removal is the best thing. You can pull it out with a water change, you could scoop it up, you could stir it up and catch it in the net if it's that bad. But let the filter do its job. But it's that brown slimy algae, and usually it'll go away within a couple of weeks. Again, a little bit of cleanliness, a little bit less food, a little bit less light. More plants also at this point may help you, as they're going to eat the same minerals that all this algae, every algae, is going for. So more plants is also an option, and that extends your service times too. Hair algae is the next one. As the tank matures, this is the next one you usually come across, and it's that green stringy, you'll see it floating in the water, and it can kind of take over everything if left unchecked. Manual removal is really the best thing. You can go in there with a toothbrush, is one of the best tools for your fish tank, and just twist it up and then spin it in the hair algae, and it'll grab it and pull it off of the hardscape that it's growing on. It usually likes to grow on stuff in the tank and on plants, not much on the glass surfaces. And usually this is, again, too much light, nutrient imbalance, or an excessive amount of nutrients that the algae can thrive on. In new tanks, we're still figuring out, the balance of all the algae that survive in your tank, and there'll always be some of a little thing, and that's fine. That's a sign of a healthy tank. It's when it's thriving and blowing in the wind. The pea puffer tank is what that picture is from. It may be because I got a little too greedy with the light, because I wanted the red tiger lotus to grow really fast, but it's the highest point, it's the closest to the light, and therefore, and there's some pretty decent flow there, and I have some floaters, but because the flow is always there, it gets the most light right on the top piece of that wood. So that hair algae is just blooming right there. Now, to get rid of hair algae, if you want, you can use a pipette, and I think I have one here. I've laid out a few things. And I take a pipette and I use it with hydrogen peroxide. Now, the way you would apply this is you could drain the water down if you can get to it. You would just, with the pipette, a couple of drops right onto the algae, and that will kill it off. I like to let it sit 10 minutes or so before I fill it back up. Now, you can do it with it underwater too, and it would be the same thing. You'd take the pipette, you'd pull some hydrogen peroxide, and what I recommend is turn your filter off, let the water get pretty still, and then put it on directly and within reason. It's going to break down, so it's not anything bad for the tank, but at the same time, I don't want the flow taking it away from where I want it. So right onto the algae itself, and then let your filter stay off for about another 10 minutes. And at that point, turn everything back on. In a few days, it'll die off, and your algae eating crew will clean it up, or you can easily remove it now with a toothbrush. Green spot algae is the next phase of the tank that you usually see, and it's that green fuzz, or the green dots as the name says. And it's all over the glass. It likes to grow on glass and hardscape. Now, I do grow it actually in one of my tanks intentionally by leaving the light on too long, and it's a grow out tank for snails to feed the pea puffers, and really just by this little 10-gallon with a kit light, nothing special, just left on for 8 hours a day. Now the room is kind of bright. It grows a ton of algae, and it's great because they thrive, and I have tons of different snails always growing and available for the pea puffers. But a new hobbyist that sets the light on for 8 hours a day and is a non-adjustable light, it's just way too long, and all it does is grow algae. So that's why I say always start off, and if I cut it down to 6, I guarantee the algae would kind of go away. The snails would eat it all up, and it wouldn't grow as much, and I wouldn't have as many snails. So that's why I leave it on and actually grow the algae intentionally. The algae is not really that bad though, because it is processing the nitrates out of the water, and this is really good for, you know, a tank that's like this one is very simple and not really any plants in it, and really just a grow out tank with some sand for snails. So something needs to help keep balance in it, and the algae is what's doing that. So algae isn't always your enemy, and we're going to get into that in a little bit more, why algae actually could be your friend. One thing that I see a lot of new hobbyists get in trouble with is the blue light, or the nighttime light that the tank comes with, and this light really isn't any benefit to anything. The blue is for us, it's to make things look better, but really not many plants use blue light to grow, so really all you're doing is growing algae. You see, algae will take anything, any sort of light, any sort of nutrient, where plants need certain lights and all nutrients in a balance in order to thrive. That's why when your nutrients are out of balance, that algae will thrive. So even not having enough of a nutrient could cause, because the plant can't thrive missing one of the many nutrients that it needs in order to grow and process photosynthesis, the algae can do it with just one. So one goes in a deficit and it can feed off of everything else, and the plants aren't using it. That's why you hear a lot of people say the plants will outcompete the algae. And that's because the plants will actually be able to use all the fertilizers that are in the water. So the blue light is really not that effective. And I'd like to give a shout out to Current USA, which is the light that's on this tank, who their nighttime light factory is red. And it'd actually be a color that the plants would process photosynthesis still. So there is a limit to the amount. I think it's 16 hours that a plant can actually do it. It does need the lights off. Your fish need the lights off. They don't have eyelids. So, you know, turning the lights off at night and really only using that night mode when you are there in order to view them, that's great. That's like, this tank is a bunch of special effects and it's great to do, but it's not something that I would leave on and as a everyday lighting. So 24-hour modes with the nighttime usually are just cool for the day, but ideally you want to not use that night light as part of your everyday program. Staghorn algae, which can be very common in a lot of new tanks, is this gray stringy algae that grows off of hardscape and off of plant leaves and is very, very hard to remove. Is the same sort of treatment with using hydrogen peroxide on the leaves, and it will kill off the algae, and then usually once it's dying off, within a couple of days it'll break off and break free and break down or get pulled up by the filter. So the staghorn algae is just another sign of there's too much nutrients, too much light, and it's thriving because other things can't. So really at this point, feed a little less, watch your nutrients, water changes to help maintain that nutrient level to keep it low, and paying attention to how fast that bioload climbs in your tank will give you an idea of how often you need that water change done. Blackbeard algae, black brush algae, BBA, there's all sorts of names for it. It's a nightmare. Every person in the aquarium hobby has experienced it, so don't feel bad that you got it. And a little bit as your tank matures is normal and will go away and clear on its own. When it starts taking over and covering the leaves of the plants, and then they could kill them off because they can't get any light, this is where it starts becoming a problem, covering your hardscape. It can be black, bushy, or even gray sometimes, and just, flowing in the water. Usually likes high flow water areas. These areas usually are combined with high light and an excessive amount of nutrients in the water. I have seen it in low flow areas too, but I think that was because of a CO2 imbalance, but we'll get into that in a minute. Same sort of treatment, hydrogen peroxide on a pipette will kill it off, and that will pretty much within a week or so die off, and really at that point the cleanup crew will kind of eat it, because when it's alive, really nearite snails, and they just don't eat anything fast enough. So not much is going to eat blackbeard algae. It's one of those things where you treat for it and you kind of want to correct the problem that caused it, so that as your tank matures, that this isn't an issue going forward. Now, as I mentioned before with CO2, for the people that are injecting CO2 in their tank, and for people wondering why, it's because if we can raise that CO2 level, we can push more light, we can push more fertilizers, because there's not much CO2 in the water compared to the air. So if we give those plants more CO2, they can process more and they'll grow faster. You can also grow harder to grow plants. The majority of the plants we're using in the hobby are plants that are not meant to be grown underwater. Very few are actually submerged plants. We're taking plants that just survive underwater. That's why we have immersed and submerged growth. You'll buy a plant and it'll melt back, and the leaves that grow back are different, or it grows back in a smaller size. That's because there's less CO2 available, and underwater the plant can't pull as much light, it can't process as much without the CO2. So with that being said, CO2 injection not being stable in a tank makes it tough on the plant because it has no balance. It can't make changes fast enough. But you know who can change really fast? Algae. So now we get the algae to thrive because the CO2 levels are constantly changing and the plants can't keep up with the nutrient demand. So really the object here is get your CO2 dialed in. In my tank here, it's a medium to high light. I'm at 60–70%, and I've got my CO2 controlled by a pH meter, so I'm very stable, and I run my CO2 a little bit before the light comes on. I shut it off with the light. I run an air stone 24/7. It's actually a sponge filter, an easy flow, and there's all sorts of reasons, and that's a different video, but the idea is that if you can find a balance and the stability in your tank, and you don't have to run it on max. I don't have my CO2 turned up as high as it can go. I'm probably 20 ppm of CO2 in the water, opposed to where I could push it to 30 and turn the light up higher, but then things get crazy and it grows too fast, and I'm totally every week have to cut everything down because it's growing too fast. So you find your happy medium, tune it into it, and what I would recommend is that you go for a lower number. Don't shoot for that 1 pH drop out of the box. Work your way into it and find your happy medium. Tune it to the light, and then once you start outpacing it, then you can add more light. But remember, one change at a time, 2 weeks to see its reply, and then make another change. This hobby has taught me one thing: it's patience. It isn't fast. I have used other products like Chem Excel. Chem Excel Flourish. I bought this giant bottle and I used it once. I filled up a pipette, took this much out of it, put it on the blackbeard algae, and then I dosed the tank, and it did an amazing job. And it almost did too good of a job. It wiped out everything. There was almost no algae in the tank at all. And so now what are the algae eaters going to eat? I started supplementing them. So eventually we started seeing some algae growth. And at that point, it was kind of back to normal. But one thing I wanted to bring up is that a lot of people will say this is liquid carbon or liquid CO2, and anything that's advertised as carbon or that liquid CO2, there is no such thing. And basically what this is an algaecide, and that algaecide is building carbonic acid chains that are part of the photosynthesis process, but isn't really CO2. So does it promote better growth in plants? Probably. I've never done it myself. It makes sense in theory that it's making the process of photosynthesis easier on the plant because it's already done some of the process for it, and it could just grab these chains and build what it needs to perform the process. But at the same time, I think that the chemical side of it is what I don't want from it, and to be married to the product. So are there people out there using it weekly and having great clean tanks and their fish are fine and their plants are thriving? Yes, absolutely. I don't want to be married to a product for my tanks to look beautiful. Cyanobacteria, this one makes everybody cringe. It's everywhere. It's one of the oldest things. There are millions of different types of cyanobacteria. It's in the marine world, it's in the ocean, it's in fresh water, it's in your fish tank. And even when it's not there, it's there. Now, cyanobacteria is a very, very old, is one of the building blocks of the planet. It was the first bacteria, they say, that produce oxygen. So we gotta thank cyanobacteria for being around for that. But the reality is that in your tank, it can be a big problem. Now, this again is a bacteria. So manual removal is the best because we can remove as much as possible before killing it off so we don't cause an ammonia spike is really the idea. Sometimes you'll see it as a green slime covering the whole bottom of the tank or the hardscape, and the reason it's the bottom of the tank, or you'll see it just at the substrate level, is usually because it's a low flow area, but a buildup of nutrients, detritus, things that have fallen in the water column because it couldn't stay suspended. Water flow is so important to how clean your tank is, because a tank with good flow and keeps everything suspended so the filter can take it up, or tanks that don't really need to be cleaned as often. So, looking at your water flow will help you with cyanobacteria because it's going to thrive in those low flow places with a lot of nutrients and too much light. Some people say that because we focus so much on algae in our tanks, the number one competitor for cyanobacteria is algae. That is his number one competitor for food. So we work our whole time and we wipe out algae, which it's like Thunderdome of cyanobacteria and algae fighting each other for the same food. And we go and take algae out. So who do you think is the winner? So cyanobacteria will thrive in those conditions. So really at this point, it's one of those reduce light, monitor your nutrients, make sure you're in balance, and it should clear on itself. Now, if it's not, that's definitely a sign that we got to make some corrections to find balance in it so that we'll be able to kill it off, or it'll die off slowly. There are products out there that will get rid of it. I used this one product, Ultralife Reef Products Blue-Green Slime Stain Remover. If this thing isn't from the 60s or what, and it's a proprietary mix, so there's no idea what's really in it, and it's this like pink salt, and it comes with this cool little spoon, and it's a 7-day treatment. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to remove carbon. You don't have to make any changes. Just add it to the tank. 3 days later, you do a second treatment if it hasn't gone away, and then it kills it off in about 7 days. Nothing in the tank is going to eat, no cleanup crew is going to eat cyanobacteria because it's a bacteria, it's not an algae. And when the cyanobacteria is in the tank, it has no harm to anything because it's only harmful if consumed and nothing wants to eat it. But it can be smelly, it can be unsightly. So I like this because it's not a chemical, it's not an antibiotic, because you'll hear a lot of people say erythromycin, and my opinion is that save the antibiotics when you really need them. If using antibiotics all the time, every time I have an issue, I'm building up a tolerance, or the fish are, to the antibiotics. So when I really need that antibiotic to work, it's not there. So it's not going to be strong enough, and we're going to build resistant strains. So I would say that you leave that off for an extreme case. This is, I think this was like $11 on Amazon. I'll throw a link down in there for some of these products, but it's got, supposedly, because there's no real answers, but what I'm gathering is that it also holds some dormant bacteria that isn't found in mature tanks. And that's why we don't really see this in mature tanks, because they've built up that balance, they've built up that bacteria load. It takes time that is going to be able to find that balance and eat this. Now, some people have even said, as far as the other bacteria that eats cyanobacteria is in the moss. And so if you put moss over it, it'll get rid of the cyanobacteria. But other people argue you're just shading the cyanobacteria, that's why it's dying off. So it hasn't really been proven, but ideally It's not adding a antibiotic into your tank for this cyanobacteria. Once again, if it's a lot of it, you want to be monitoring ammonia levels. If there's an ammonia spike, be changing water, adding prime. But at pretty much manual removal, I used this product, I had no issues with it, and it was very effective. So if you made it this far, you want to know how you can make it that you don't have to fight with all these algae. One thing to focus on is the cleanup crew. What do you want to have in your tank? Some people don't mind snails. You can get meteorite snails and mystery snails. They're snails that won't populate in your tank because they need brackish water, so you don't have to worry about them overrunning your tank. A snail boom in your tank is a sign of overnutrients and that you're overfeeding, and simply feeding less the snails will die off over time. Shrimp, cosmetic shrimp like cherry shrimp, stuff like that, aren't really that effective. They help you kind of maintain, but they're not huge eaters. There are plenty of fish out there that are very good, and depending on the fish you keep is the fish you could use. The rule is if a fish can fit the other one in his mouth, he's going to eat it. So small fish, I have a lot of guppies and pea puffers, so a lot of nano to small fish. Otocinclus is a wonderful, super peaceful, should be kept in groups. Strict vegetarian, doesn't, picks up protein just by picking up things that are with it, but for the most part is a strict vegetarian and is a great fish at cleanup and will eat almost every algae. Amano shrimp are great. Unfortunately, amano shrimp need salt or brackish water to breed or to hatch, so you're not going to get them to breed in your tank like you will Caridina shrimp or Caridina shrimp in a fish tank will normally, breed. But the way that they work is that they're just ferocious eaters and they just eat everything, but you have to have fish that aren't going to eat them. Florida flagfish, they're really good. I mean, I'm sure if you do a search, you can find there's tons of fish out there. I kind of lean towards the smaller stuff, so I really know those more, but I'm sure if you look around, you'll be able to find plenty of fish that would fit your tank as in a cleanup crew. Water changes are an essential part of keeping your tank balanced, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you to change your water every week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, not at all, or only when you need to. That is really what this hobby is all about, is to learn what your tank needs and what your demands from your tank is telling you. By testing and fertilizing, you can find those balances. Usually what we're seeing in a lot of cases where people are fertilizing a tank and they have an algae bloom, the first thing they do is they stop fertilizing, and it gets worse because there is probably a deficiency. And only if we're testing, because I say it all the time, if you're not testing, you're guessing. So we have to get in there and start testing. If we're fertilizing and we feel we're doing everything right and there's still algae everywhere, you can't control it, that's probably because there is some sort of deficiency, and it may be in your fertilizers. I mean, I use 2-Hour Aquarist and Aquarium Co-op. These are two very good brands. Nylock G, which I want to try, is another one that is very good, and a lot of people rave about it. And really, these all-in-ones for most of the hobby, I believe, is really the best thing. There are other methods where you're doing every nutrient individually every day and then a water change at the end of it. It's very intense, things grow crazy, and I don't think that's what everybody's looking for. I think this is a good balance with these all-in-ones. It makes it very simple, delivery method simple, and when we're doing these types of things, we can kind of be pretty sure that we're setting the nitrate levels and we're getting enough of all the other nutrients that are required to keep the water in balance. So really what you're looking for is to balance your bioload and your plants, and basically looking at, if I have a lot of fish, I'm going to have to change the water more often. If I have a lot more plants than fish, I probably won't need to change the water as often. Keeping all those minerals in balance and check, and that will fight off algae, and that'll keep you in there. And part of that is your water change for when those nitrate levels that can't be exhausted fast enough are rising. One thing you can do is add floaters. Red root floaters are beautiful. Floating plant helps add a little shade to the tank, but at the same time, they populate and grow all over the place, and they pull nitrates out very, very, very fast. And you could just scoop some out and throw them out, and you've just eliminated the nitrates. So floating plants, I don't even want to say it, duckweed, which I have a lot in my tanks, and it's in the pea puffer tank, and it does a great job. Now you got a 30-gallon tank there, 29, that has got 5 autosynclists and 6 pea puffers in all that. And that's a 40-gallon tank and has an uncountable amount of guppies, probably in the hundreds. And that tank can go 3 to 4 weeks without a water change. The pea puffer tank just gets it just simply because there's so much stone in there. I get a pH rise from the stone, so I'm changing the water to keep pH levels where I want them to be. But all these things, that's, you know, you have to understand, one tank gets a water change because of pH levels, one gets a water change because of nitrates, and to want to replenish nutrients, where the other pea puffer tank's low tech, low light, so you don't need to be as intense. And that tank grows crazy, so you can see it in one of the other care videos. But it's really just about finding what your tank needs and doing that. The way to beat algae is start with your lights down lower. Try and build up rather than shoot high and come down. And I would recommend the same thing if you're new to CO2s, do the same thing. And I'd recommend the same thing with your fertilizers. The reality is that every tank is different, and there is no instructions on a bottle that's made for your tank. You know what? Why don't you go check out the pea puffer video right here? You can get a good look at that tank.